In this video, I'm going to talk about how poverty has been contributing to African Americans' education.
Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me. And before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave.
As John Dewey said, education is no preparation for life, it is life itself. History shows that education is a right that has been denied for African Americans since the colonization. A former professor of the University of Pennsylvania quoted, "Slaveholders were adamantly opposed to the education of their slaves because they feared an educated population would threaten their authority." In some southern states such as Alabama, South Carolina, and Virginia, there were laws established that prohibited slaves to be educated. There were also laws that prohibited slaveholders to teach their slaves to write and read. Nevertheless, many slaves worked hard to learn how to read and write and do math. In the document Maryland and the Underground Railroad says that sometimes slaves learned from each other or from free blacks. Sometimes white people taught them. Moreover, religion played a huge role in black literacy. In Baltimore, the churches provided Shabbat schools to slaves that taught them literacy and basic math. Although in the age of slavery, some slaves learned the basics of literature, this does not mean that they had the same opportunities as whites. The Civil War started in 1861 and ended in 1865. The war started with a disagreement between the southern and northern states to abolish slavery. Once the war ended, the slaves were emancipated. However, most slaves were uneducated, did not have money, did not own lands. With the lack of the most basic resources, the African Americans had to remain in the agricultural work instead of doing less heavy labors. Despite the poor situation in which the black community was living, they got the initiative to raise money, to purchase land, and constructed buildings. According to a document called America's Reconstruction, the first black colleges were created right after the Civil War. Howard University in Washington, D.C., Fisk University in Tennessee, Hampton Institute in Virginia are some of the examples of those institutions. However, the white community did not want blacks to be educated. They continued to implement new tactics that prevent black progression, for example, segregation. Education is key for economic success, and it is true. That's why white people did not and do not want the African Americans to be educated. During the Jim Crow era, schools were racially segregated. Whites and blacks had to attend different schools. Unfortunately, education for blacks was inferior in many ways than for whites. For example, there were not so many public schools available for blacks than for whites, and the few schools available for blacks were in bad conditions. The black schools had leaking roofs, sagging floor, windows without glasses, and among other conditions. During the era of segregation, most blacks lived in rural areas. That was another reason why their education was in a vulnerable condition, because the city schools system had more money than the rural ones. For example, if a town did not have enough money for two separate schools, they rather construct one for whites and none for the African Americans. These problems occurred during the era of the Jim Crow laws. Unfortunately, many blacks still live in that same situation. Although the segregation ended by the civil rights movement, the reality is that the law implemented in the segregation era remains the same today. African Americans have been going through many tough times: slavery, civil war, segregation, and all that for having the same rights, education, and opportunities. In the 21st century, we may think that African Americans have the same opportunities as whites or any other ethnicity. Unfortunately, the African American community is far from being educated or having the same economic level as their fellow Caucasian Americans. In the United States, one of the highest spots on poverty belongs to the black population with 20.1%, comparing it with the white people with 8.7%. However, black women face a very high risk in poverty with 30.1%. This means that the American society has been racist against black women and men, and the government has and will never step up to fix the unfair action that the school system has implemented on blacks. This graph shows that blacks' education throughout the last half century has been always below the rate of whites' education. The actual school system knows that giving blacks a better education will threaten the white supremacy. That's why black schools are in bad shapes than schools where the students are overwhelmingly white. In short, the modern segregation consists in not giving the blacks the same quality of education as the quality provided to the Caucasian student. Therefore, education is a right that has been denied for the African American since the era of slavery and still existing in our days, because the only way to keep the blacks inferior is not giving them education, as the slaveholders said during the slavery era.